Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Here with Jason. Jason, I'm not going to act like we didn't just talk for 20 minutes off air. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. But can you please introduce yourself to everybody?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. So my name is Jason Hallett. I'm a professor at Imperial College in London in the United Kingdom, although you can probably tell from my accent, I'm actually a native of the United States. And I work on sustainable energy and renewables. So how do we make all of the things that we make right now, but from biomass rather than from oil and gas?
Can you explain to me a little bit about biomass? Because I'm still kind of new to that. Like I've dived into the topic of renewables, and it's a fun topic. It's very interesting because to me, I always look at it like it's like 10 people running the same race. Like everyone's going to the same goalpost of trying to find an energy, but also everyone's got their own bias in a sense of like if you're a solar guy, you're probably wearing a sun on your t-shirt, and then you have something like that where they all have really good insight. I'm just wondering if we can make like a meeting of the minds to have everybody at one table, like talk about like, I want to do solar. All right, we could do solar, but what about hydro? I could do hydro. Then, so I'm just curious. Tell me a little bit about biomass.
Yeah. So I guess we'd have a tree on our t-shirt if we're working with biomass, but biomass is based on the premise that or biomass to energy or biomass to materials or biomass to whatever is based on the premise that this is carbon that we have taken out of the atmosphere. And by we, I mean trees have absorbed CO2 from the atmosphere and turned it into materials. And if we harvest those materials, then the trees will replenish themselves. And as long as we don't harvest that carbon faster than the forest can replenish it, we could get into an energy neutral territory. Of course, I do sometimes joke that this is a bit of solar energy because, of course, the trees are getting their energy from the sun. So it is a rather inefficient solar panel, but one that we don't have to do any maintenance on. Mother Nature takes care of it for us.
What are the upsides of, because I know you would get more oxygen from trees and everything, but I think what I always hear is that when you have a tree, it's like storage. It just stores the carbon, and then if like a tree burns or something, or if a tree gets cut down, it releases it right back into the thing. So it's not really getting rid of it. And I go, well, I mean, would you look at that as like a permanent solution, or would you look at that as like a temporary solution?
Well, from an energy point of view, it's probably a temporary solution. I personally think that all of us in renewable energy are buying time for fusion at the moment. But it is sort of something that we could implement right now, and it's one of the easiest ways of converting from a fossil fuel based economy to a non-fossil fuel based economy, because it is a step down, but not a radical step down. The biggest advantage, of course, is scale. And at the moment, 100 billion tons a year of cellulose grows on planet Earth. So that's the 50% of a plant is cellulose. And 100 billion tons of that grows on planet Earth every year without us doing anything. I think it's 180 billion tons. It's a lot. For reference, that's 5 times the CO2 emissions that we have. So it is of the right scale that we could utilize it to replace all of our energy and materials demands. The other nice thing about it is that it is a material, so it's a thing. Whereas there are other renewable energy technologies, solar and wind and whatnot, and they're all wonderful. Biomass is effectively the only place that we can get renewable carbon or stuff, and it's very difficult to take an electron or electricity and turn it into a laptop or a book or anything like that. And it's much easier to do that with a tree.
But like even if with trees, for instance, now the way that you're kind of looking at it is like you can get something like carbon, for instance, that is good for plant life. Like it is, plants need that. So if you could just plant more plants, it would get rid of the carbon and would be beneficial to both relationships.
Yeah, and reforestation is certainly a topic in terms of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. The problem there is that depending on where you live, in Europe, we have spent the past 1,000 years, or they have spent the past 1,000 years. I only lived here for 15, but removing forest in order to build bigger and bigger cities. And so it's very difficult to reforest in areas where the land is occupied by people. North America actually has more trees now than it did at the turn of the 20th century. And that reforestation was done for the most part by the paper or the forestry industry is probably a better way of putting it. So it was a managed resource. And so actually North America's been a carbon sink for the last century or so, whereas Europe's been more of a carbon source on a global ecosystem cycle. I mean, I'm not talking about the human activity. I'm talking about the natural activity. And that sort of balance is quite important. So increasing global biomass is certainly possible, but increasing it by enough to counteract 40 billion tons of CO2 emissions is not just a challenge, it's probably impossible. So we're going to have something else too.
Would that be just because we don't have enough we'd have to make designated areas to plant a massive amount of trees to be able to do so. But that's so hard because I guess this is where people talk about like the overpopulation issue and all these types of aspects. I don't know if it's an overpopulation thing. Maybe it's just the fact that we just build a lot of homes and we expand out. I mean, you could look on a graph the number of homes that nobody's living in. They're just empty homes, but we just were like, oh, we're going to build a neighborhood here, and then nobody's in that neighborhood for a couple of years. And next thing you know, you have all these concrete and you have all these buildings. And I mean, I guess it's the expansion of cities. I understand that, but also it's why people like rural areas so much. And then eventually those rural areas aren't going to be rural anymore. They're not going to be, a couple of people or Farmer Jim, out on his farm. It's not going to be like that anymore. It's going to be people right beside each other again. And it's a market that can be capitalized. I mean, that's a business aspect of things. If you look at how the world's been going, which I hope we don't get there. I think more people are being more conscious about at least the planet in some sense. But like I was telling you off air, I think the argument gets lost on like just the planet warming or not. Like we got to move past that discussion. We got to get down to what can we find a way to make sure that something that is producing a massive amount of carbon into the atmosphere, for instance, we don't have to eliminate it in a sense. I just don't think we're going to get a good consensus on that. But we can go, how do we wean off the tit of it? How do we get to something where we can use other renewables until we do buy time? I mean, I'm still very new on fusion energy, but I look at a combination of renewable energies that could be the possibility of the future in a sense.
Yeah, and I do think that mix is important, right? And 40 billion tons is scary, right? The entire petrochemical industry, so that's the materials, that's plastics and chemicals and things, is about 500 million tons, so a half a billion. And we emit 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So put another way, we don't make anything on the scale that we make carbon dioxide. And in fact, everything that we make, all of human activity put together, does not add up to a tenth of what we put out in terms of CO2 emissions. And so in that sense, getting from that to zero by 2050 or 2100 or 2200 is a really tall ask. And so it's something that we have to make a concerted effort to figure out what we want. And one thing you can do, as you were talking about with the expansion of cities, is curb our human activity, so stop us from doing things that we want. That's a very difficult sell in terms of political will, telling people that they can't do this or they can't do that, or you can't live in the city. I grew up in the country and now I live in the city. I prefer the city. So I'd hate to be told I have to go back and live in the country. On the flip side of that, of course, we can't keep going in this sort of ever expanding, ever increasing utilization because we'll run out of resource. And so we've got to figure out a way to bridge that gap such that we can continue doing what we want to do, at least within reason, but in a way that is, I guess you could say, permanently sustainable. So you could keep doing it forever, and the planet wouldn't suffer as a result. And unless we're going to reforest the desert, the Sahara Desert or something, it's going to be a really tall order to do all of that just by growing more trees, or just by an increase in biomass. So there's got to be a change in the way that we run our economy also.
Well, from your personal perspective, do you think that people just go into the idea of renewable energies with wrong intentions? It's like whenever I hear the renewable discussion get brought up, it seems like they're looking at it like that's going to be the future energy for the rest of humanity or rest of time. And I think you're like the first person that I've come across that's kind of looked at it as like it's going to be temporary. Like we can do it a temporary sense until we get whatever. And like you were saying with fusion, like that, I have never heard anybody even really bring that up before. I've seen like articles with the Hadron Collider about it and stuff like that. Like, did we discover this? But I look at it like it seems like a lot of people think that like there's already a science that's out there that's going to be the best solution to it. And I always go like maybe it's a combination, like I was mentioning, a combination of all those types of things. I mean, the hardest thing to do is if you're talking about planting more trees, is you got to stop people from going out there. And that's like the toughest thing to do right now. I mean, I look at all the places I used to drive by when I was 12 years old or 10 years old. I used to ride by, whatever. I wasn't old enough to drive, I don't think. Um, but I was, in the car riding by all these places. They used to be giant fields and giant forestry. They're just gone. There's Walmarts, there's Starbuckses, there's this. And it's all like, well, this is what humankind does. We terraform our planet. Yeah, but we can also terraform it in a good way too. I mean, I just worried about also other things like contaminants, plastics, for instance. I don't know if you saw Shanna Swan talk about phthalates when she talked about the number of plastic that's in our blood right now is reducing our fertility count, literally making people's taint smaller, which is somehow linked to fertility, which that's science for you. It's interesting as hell. But I think that's a giant worry because then you look at areas wherever I see a documentary about, and I talk to someone about like metal compounds in water, all these types of things that are contaminants in our water, contaminants in our house from even dust particles and all these things. I start going, I get it where people go, like, how is dust going to have some type of effect on me? It might not affect you, it might affect your kids, or maybe after a long exposure to it, you might start suffering from something. I don't know. But the fact is, you're breathing it in 24/7. So maybe you should clean your ceiling fan. Like, these are all things that, like, it seems logical when you say it out loud, but it's just weird how we're now starting to look into these types of things. Like, holy crap, our rivers are polluted with metals. How do we get rid of that? I have no clue, but I'm glad somebody's finally talking about it because I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah, well, there was a lot in that, but the air quality, the water quality. I mean, these are big issues. And there are a couple studies that I've seen recently. I live in London, so I'm paying attention to the ones in London, but they have really scared me. One was on microplastics, so similar to the phthalates. How many tiny plastic particles there are in the air here, and whatever 10 years of my lifespan is being reduced just by living in this city. And the other one is that there are still residual particles from the coal-fired power plants in London. Now they banned the coal-fired power plants in London. Oh, I don't know when the last one was, 1920, something like that. It's been 100 years, and the pollution from that is still here. And so these things are quite persistent. So I think one of the things that's a bit depressing is how long this lasts. Now, I grew up in Maine, alongside a river, the Penobscot River, that was very heavily polluted by the textile industry. At the time, it was historic, right? So before I was born, that this had happened, and now it's beautiful. And we are doing better with air and water pollution compared to even in my lifespan. So 40 years, we are doing much better than we were 40 years ago. And so it seems depressing when people like me talk about how awful things are going. Well, actually, things are getting better. They're possibly not getting better quickly enough, but they are getting better in sense of how we take care of the planet. As a race, as a species, we cannot destroy this planet, right? We can make it uninhabitable. The planet's a rock. It's a 4.5 billion year old rock, and it created life without us. And if we wipe it all out, it will do it again. So in that sense, we can only be self-defeating. And so I think it is in our interest to clean this up because the people ultimately that suffer from it are us. I do agree with you on the energy mix. Also, I'm not a physicist, so I'm not an expert in fusion, but it is effectively, in a sense, it is creating our own mini sun. And the sun, I forget the lifespan of the sun. I think it's about 20 billion years. So that sort of an energy source is quite long lasting. And so if we could ever get to that where we could harness that kind of an energy source here on Earth rather than up in the solar system, then that would solve all of our energy problems. In the meantime, I think we're going to need a lot of things, and the ones that we shouldn't be focusing on necessarily are the ones that are not replenishable. So that would be fossil fuels. It would be much better if they were things that we could keep using forever, whichever renewables they are.
And something that could be, well, see, the thing with even looking at renewable energies, what I've noticed is people, like, even if you ask around my street, I could take the example of my town. We were going to put wind turbines a mile offshore, but the whole town complained. And they're like, well, you'd have a better source of energy. It's like, yeah, but we don't want to see that. And if you notice anywhere where we get our fuels from overseas or something like that, it would make more sense to have it here. But the issue is people don't want to have that near them. I mean, I looked into the whole aspect of sustainable mining. Now, I will say the research studies that I looked in, that a lot of them are gas companies that were funneling that research study. So I'm like, you might have a little bit of a bias. I don't know. But I have a friend who is very, very, he wrote books on the mining topic, and he talked about there isn't a way to effectively do that. But the issue is that you're asking a company to clean up their mess when they get done. And that is not such an easy task. So I look at every single aspect of things and I go, most of this is probably human error. Mostly it's maybe not like a human mistake in science aspect, but more like a human thing of laziness when it comes to cleaning up your mess when you get done. So I go, when we talk about like planting trees or finding areas of forestry, is there a possibility that we can just capture on the movement? Like, because everyone gets sad when they go, where do you want to go for like a vacation? Oh, I'm going to go to Yellowstone. It's like you have to go to a specific area that's a preserve for the natural, like a reservation. You have to go to those now. There, you just can't walk into your backyard and have the trees. There's a lot of people there that really appreciate, that nature aspect of things. Now, if you're telling them instead of having a mine to get your energy in your backyard, you could just have a bunch of trees and a bunch of wild landscape. I mean, at that point, I think your pool can wait. There's these types of things you get into this aspect of stuff where it's like if we had designated locations or we had just more of an advocacy for trying to bring back these natural aspects of our planet that would help out, even if it's a small scale. I know everyone goes, well, that's such a small scale, it's not going to change anything right now. It's like, well, it's not about right now, but it's also reducing the risk of things as well too. I mean, if you can look at how long that might be in 10 years or 50 years, and then people will just say, oh, we don't have enough time. I'm like, well, when you think like that, then any idea, that's an idea. It gets shot down and then we don't ever do it. And then 20 years from now, you're like, why didn't we start doing that? It's like, well, this is what it's a snake biting its own tail. And I just go, I think humans aren't good at long-term problems. We're good when it's like right in front of us, like you're gonna die tomorrow. But then when it's like, oh, you got to worry about that in like me, whenever I have a problem, I go, that's a future Robbie problem. Like I'll push that down and then the day comes and I'm like, holy shit, why didn't I worry about this?
No, it's true. It is a bit of human nature, and I think it's maybe a bit flippant, but I think the way to look at this, well, why do we keep kicking the climate change for its own, or whatever, the carbon emissions issue into the future? Well, what people like me are asking people like you to do is to intentionally disadvantage yourselves and your children to benefit your great grandchildren. And that is a really tough sell, to say, okay, I'm going to make life more difficult for me and my family in order to ensure that the future population is going to benefit a future population that I can't see, right? It's 100 years from now or whatever. And that is really, really hard. Climate change is gradual. And so all of these changes, whether it's pollution or whether it's global warming or whether it's whatever, it all takes place at such a slow pace that we can't see it immediately, and so it's quite simple to assume that we'll be able to fix it in time. Maybe we will, and maybe we won't. But like I said, it's real hard to take that short-term pain, because it's not just your pain. It's also your children. And I don't know, if you were planning out how the human race would live, you wouldn't do what we do right now, right? So you took a really high level view and you say, we're going to put the people here. I don't know where you would put people necessarily. In the US, it might be Northern California and Maryland. I don't know, but you'd want some places not too hot and not too cold, so you don't have to run air conditioners and you don't have to run a lot of heaters, right? And that sort of thing. I mean, we didn't set out to cause these problems. They were part of us adapting to the places that we were living, and convenience. And we do a lot of things for convenience, and we, increases in terms of affluence. So people having more money, people do more things that are fun. And I mean, that's quite natural. And so I think minimizing that impact is really what's important. Planning it out is really that important. I don't think we necessarily need to change our behavior. We need to think seriously about the consequences of it. And every time I get on an airplane, this is what occurs to me, right? I mean, this is, I am intentionally doing something that used to be very rare and has become more and more common as it's become more and more, cheaper and more accessible to people. And when a few people were flying around, it wasn't so bad. But when everybody's flying around, okay, it starts to add up.
Well, it's the human, I guess, capacity to want to expand out farther. And I mean, we want to grow, we want to keep producing more, and we got more, and with more production. It's like prosperity. There's always a lot of like more growth and prosperity, and but so that's with comfortability. The thing is that when we get so comfortable to where everything's prosperous, and people can say, well, we have a war going on. Yeah, yeah. But when it comes to getting your supplies that you need from the grocery store, you can do that at any time you want compared to back in the day when you used to have to hunt for your food. And this is where I got started getting very interested with the supply chain, was because when I started understanding it more, I started realizing that, like, yeah, you can say like media probably does the worst damage on like the supply chain in a sense. I think it panics people to panic buy stuff. But when you go to, like, I had this explained with the Jif scandal, or the Jif contamination problem that's going on right now. He goes, it's just Jif. You can get another form of peanut butter, but as soon as someone tells you that you can't get your Jif now, you freak out, and then everyone panic buys it, and then it becomes a really, really big issue. And I go, I feel like if people were explained like that about just certain things, like, it's going to be very, very hard to sales pitch, like, hey, we got to make your life a little bit harder and your kids' life a little bit harder to save your grandkids. For some people that don't have kids, it's an easy sight goal. People already, so like, I don't like myself, so I'm just like, yeah, I'm good. I'll be more than happy to save the future generations. I'm not worried about it. But also, I think it comes down to this aspect of, when you talk about sacrifice, I mean, we do that now as well too, in ways that aren't our decisions. I mean, gas prices. We've gotten used to, in some sense, the price of gas. There was complaining the first couple of months, but I mean, it went from up to $6, and then now it's at 4.63, and everyone's like, "Oh, thank God, gas is 4.63." I'm like, "Remember last year when it was 3.13?" Then they bring it to the politics. I go, "Ah, don't blame politics for this. That's just your adaptation. You adapt so quickly. Brown paper bags is a good example as well too. We took out plastic at our grocery stores. Now we have brown paper bags. Everyone's used to the brown paper bags. You got some places that have plastic, but like, people stopped complaining about it. They complain for a couple of weeks and then they move on. Yeah, it might get a little bit harder on some things, but when you look at the overall long-term goal, I think if people are explained to it in the right manner with some simple adjustments and even small scale stuff, you can say supply chain would be small scale. Even though it has a massive impact on a lot of things. But if you just, let them know, like, hey, if you can do this, this might be out, but you can get this. And then you don't have to worry about panicking. And then, things don't fluctuate in the market and everything stays stable. Then if you just talk about maybe modifying or doing some type of thing with, I've talked to a guy who studies mycology, and he talked about being able to alter fungus to actually eat plastic. And you start going, even if it's like something like, we don't really, I mean, people don't aren't aware of a plastic in the ocean, or I mean, we know about plastic bag, but like microchemicals, I would say people might not be aware of that or more educated on it. But if you have a way of being able to eliminate those compounds, metallic compounds, these types of things, to be able to make the air a little bit cleaner using this type of technology, that we can get there if we start researching it now. I mean, that's not crazy. And people go, well, what does that do with carbon? It's like, well, maybe we can't get rid of that just yet, but we're also working on other ways and areas that can become a problem, much like is a problem.
Yeah. I think there's two elements to that, right? Part of it's convenience, and we have made things more and more convenient in some cases where we probably shouldn't have. But a lot of it's about not being aware of consequences, and I don't mean this in terms of the general public, or even scientists. We didn't know, right? When we started burning fossil fuels or whatever, we didn't know that carbon dioxide or whatever was going to cause problems. We didn't know as much about pollution as we do now, and I think that led to a lot of activities that we probably should never have undertaken in the first place. And plastics are fantastic for certain things. We don't actually need to make everything out of them. And I remember somebody asking me once, wouldn't it be great if we could figure out exactly how much emitting a ton of CO2 costs us? What's the total cost to society in terms of health and all? It's like, well, actually, we know exactly what the figure is. It's been calculated to death and back, and I forget what it is. It's about $120 a ton or something. If you applied that, you'd get gasoline at $6 or $7 or something a gallon, and that's probably what it is really costing us, so to speak, before taxes, not after taxes. That's probably what it is costing us. It's just we're taking the money from other places because we felt it was more convenient at the time. And I do worry sometimes. You mentioned the paper and the plastic, and I'm old enough that I remember when it was paper and we switched to plastic because we thought it was more sustainable. Now we're switching back to paper because we think it's more sustainable. And the answer, in actual fact, is it depends on how you look at it. Paper is biodegradable, so it will destroy itself in the environment just like trees rot. Paper will rot, and plastic will not, at least not on a 1,000-year time frame. But on the other hand, paper bags are a lot heavier than plastic bags. And so they have a lot more embedded energy, and so a lot more CO2 emissions. So the carbon emissions from paper bags are higher than plastic bags, not lower. The air pollution is higher, the water pollution is higher. But on the other hand, if they get into the ocean, they'll just dissolve and disappear. And so you're trading one problem for another, but it's not as if either option is perfect, right? And this is great. They both have their issues. And I use a lot of cloth bags because people give them to me, but of course, cotton is the most water intensive crop. And so now we're using up another quite precious limited resource in water in order to save on something else. And so there's never a free ride here. We have to decide what consequences we're willing to accept for our activities and how we're going to pay for those consequences down the road.
I spoke to an environmental biologist. His name is Umax Lee. And he takes it in a different approach than I do. He takes a more spiritual path when it comes to like the idea of Buddhism being a good steward to the planet that you're on. I think that's a good goal but for people who aren't religious like me, then I have to find another one. So I go to the aspect of it's not really about eliminating the damage that you do, but it's about reducing it to a point where it's not as big as it was before. I mean, we talk about our carbon footprint. People can reduce their digital footprint by just not posting up pictures of themselves every 5 minutes. So you get to this aspect of reducing your carbon footprint. Does that mean taking a bike everywhere you go, even if you if you have to go to work 2 hours away? No, that doesn't mean that. But it's simple things like very, very small scale stuff when it comes to using your washer only like once a week or something like that. Like, say these little small things that, I mean, they're just, it's not really like unknown. It's just not really showed to you. It's not this priority type deal because we are learning about these issues. It's because we are in a business model. We have been in a business model, but now we're looking at it with a personal perspective. And there's two ways you can really look at that. You can take your personal and want the business to change, or you can change to the business. And both of those have their risks, have their damage to it. But I think when we talk about like if we talk about switching over to another renewable or something like that, it's going to have its problems. Solar, I mean, yeah, you get certain hours a day you can use it, but what about some places that have clouds all the time that aren't able to reach the sun? You're not getting as much power. Then there's energy stores, and there's ideas of carbon capture, where there's people that want to pump CO2 into the ground. And I don't know what that does either. I talked to a guy who studies the Earth's core, and he was telling me, he's like, that's not a good idea at all. And I'm like, I have no clue. I'm like, I don't know what the damage is. There's so much out there to learn where I start going, this is a great way and a good idea of just looking at everything and making like a pros and cons chart of stuff. I mean, if we can talk about how much waste do we have out there right now? There's Trash Island I know about. There's so much waste. I see a mask floating in a puddle. It's literally the perfect picture of depression. And okay, so what can we do to be able to reduce waste? Does that mean we switch to a more, I guess, biodegradable fuel? Or does that mean we are able to use this type of I wouldn't say bioengineering, but some type of rewiring to be able to break this stuff down faster with some type of, I don't know, I'm going to say something crazy like spray or something.
Potentially, but it's all about shifting impact. This is something that we have always done as human beings, is we have shifted impact. And you mentioned about driving 2 hours to work. We've made that affordable by shifting the impact of that activity away from the person who's buying the fuel. And I mean, that's not, there is a massive negative impact to the environment in driving a car 2 hours a day. That is really bad. And it shouldn't be affordable, but it is. So I don't, there isn't a magic way of fixing that, because it's part of human activity. And we've unbalanced the natural system of the planet, right? Mount Etna is still the largest CO2 emitter in the world. It's a volcano in Italy. At least last I knew it was the largest. Maybe another volcano has passed it, I don't know. But there's a lot of carbon dioxide emissions that come from the natural environment. It's not just us. The problem is nature balanced itself in terms of what was emitted and what was removed from the atmosphere. And then we came along and we perturbed that system a lot. And we haven't done the counter activity. And I think if you're going to drive a car for 2 hours, what are you going to do to take that CO2 back out of the atmosphere? And that really is the question that we need to answer. And it filters through to everything. And whatever solutions scientists come up with, people like me, technology developers come up with, back to your thing about the supply chain earlier, it's going to take a while to implement. If we had the perfect solution tomorrow, even if it is solar panels, it's going to take a while. We can't just all of a sudden snap our fingers and make enough solar panels in order to produce all of the energy that we produce right now in power stations. It would take a long time to develop the supply chains, the manufacturing capacity. That would take decades. And so none of these things are going to transform overnight. And so we really do have to think about how we're going to manage sort of the transition into not being stupid in how we go about our lives.
How much carbon or how much emissions get put out when they try and reduce waste?
I don't know. It's a good question. You talk about incineration
Yeah, I mean, just
when they
anything to
burn
get
it.
rid of the trash and stuff. Because I
When they
start
burn it.
wondering, because you're a chemical engineer as well too. So if you can use a type of chemical that can break it down easier without, I guess, producing as much emissions.
Well, I mean, you can and you can't, right? I mean, you can pyrolyze it, which is basically burning it without oxygen, so heating it really hot without oxygen, which turns effectively, in the simplest terms, it turns it into coal. If you did that and then buried it, that would be one way of getting rid of it without causing CO2 emissions. But generally speaking, waste reduction ends up um, the ultimate result is CO2 emissions. So we burn the waste, or we degrade the waste, or we biodegrade the waste. It ends up emitting CO2. Funnily enough, the only exception to that is those non-biodegradable plastics that we're trying so hard to get rid of, which don't degrade and therefore don't emit carbon dioxide. So in some respects, they are representing locked up carbon. And I always say, I work a lot on plastic recycling, and I always say that the problem actually isn't the plastic, it's that we keep throwing it in the ocean. that's that's really the issue. If we quit doing that, if we manage the disposal, actually is quite harmless, but we don't. And back to the thing about convenience and the expansion of human activity, we just make a lot of stuff, and we don't think about that stuff because it's not very valuable, it's not very expensive. And if it cost a lot of money to throw something out the window, nobody would throw stuff out the window. And that I think is the problem, is that we do things that we don't realize are damaging, or as damaging as they are, and there are no consequences for doing them, or no immediate consequences. And if we were better behaved, we wouldn't need to think about those consequences. So how do we make the human beings stop acting like 5-year-olds? I don't know.
I think people will fall in line with whatever, I guess, the idea of, like, I know, like, especially in my town, it's the main slogan is leave only your footprints. No cigarette butts on the beach. They've implemented no littering or all these signs and stuff. Now, for the first month or so, no one really listened to that. But then you have a lot of families and tourism that come down here, and they kind of led by example. And next thing you know, the only time you get one is, I think we look at what the damage we do as just us, and it's not going to impact as much. And I start going, well, if everybody thinks like that, then you have a whole bunch of people heading in the direction where we're heading in now, where it's just a bunch of people not caring, driving diesel trucks or whatever that we can do, to just make our lives easier. Which I get it; it's convenience. That makes sense. So I don't think it would be as hard as to get people to fall in line. I think it's just kind of leading by example in a sense. Like there's certain people that do that, and having like calm discussions like you're doing about it as well too. Because whenever I talk about the climate topic, it's like you have a dot on your forehead, like you're going to get shot, if you slip up or something. But when we talk about like getting businesses to fall in line, I feel like also they should have, like, I know some companies do like that green movement stuff, but I don't know how much of it is just on paper. Like I want to actually know what they're doing about some things as well too, because I trust corporations, some corporations, but like a lot of the bigger ones, it seems like I'm coming across an article that says $100,000 paid to waste pollution in this river and this type of thing, and I start going, like, you got to do more than that. Like I get it, like you have green like leaf on your logo or something like that, but also like we got to look at ways of like what else are you doing to implement, or I mean, even if that means you're going to lose some profit because people are going, like, sun chips. everyone started buying Sun Chips when they found out the bag was biodegradable. And then an article came out later and figured out that the bags actually aren't biodegradable at all. They're just really, really freaking loud. And that's like but a lot of people were sales pitched on the idea, oh, I'm kind of helping out the earth in a sense when I eat Sun Chips. And it's like they didn't need that much convincing. They just needed to be showed something in a way that they agree with. And then eventually everyone likes Sun Chips. They taste good. So it's like you got people buying Sun Chips. Now that was the company's trick, but like let's do it and make it real though. Let's make it to where there is products that are available. It might cost a little bit more, but I guarantee you, if that's the only option that's there, people are still going to buy it anyway, no matter the price.
Yeah, and we always have to be careful about either unintended consequences or unknown consequences, and apart from actual nefarious activity and people deceiving each other, most of the time those types of problems are caused by either a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding of what will happen. I think in general, I'm old and cynical, but you have to work with systems, not against them, and that does include the planet, and does include the ecosystem, and does include nature. But that, if you live in a capitalist society, what's the easiest way to get companies to be more sustainable? Well, make it profitable. So consumer pressure is a very wonderful thing. And if the people will buy things that are more sustainable over things that are less sustainable, everything will suddenly become more sustainable. And if you live in a more totalitarian society, of course, the government can just tell people what to do. But I don't know. I'm American, so that doesn't appeal to me as an option. But sure, there are parts of the world where that's what happens, and it does work. But I think if this is what people want, then there are ways of making that sort of public pressure and that kind of sort of consumer activism work in favor of better solutions. But sure, those consumers have to know that they're picking the right winner. And I talk a lot to what we call NGOs. I don't know if you call them that in the US, but Greenpeace would be a great example of one. But environmental groups, and they are quite afraid at times of endorsing certain technologies or certain technological solutions because they're not sure of the consequences. Bioplastics is a great example, because they don't know if it's better or worse, because we haven't used it enough to know exactly what's going to happen with it. And that kind of caution is nice, but when people throw it all to the wind, you get whatever the Sun Chips. But I heard about the biodegradable bags. I definitely heard about that. That's what happens when people jump in too fast and they don't know. We had a big scandal here in London, which I was in the unfortunate position of predicting when they banned the plastic straws and I said, well, they just replace them with paper straws, which is not better. It's actually worse from a point of view of environmental impact. And then they did it anyway, and it turns out about 6 months later, it was like, oh yeah, actually this was a terrible move. Well, of course it was, right? It was just a misunderstanding of what the alternatives are. You talked about mining earlier. I mean, historically, mining is a terrible activity. I think it's probably the most destructive human activity that we have ever undertaken. We drill gigantic holes in the ground. We pour acid into those holes. We take the metals out. I mean, this is not good. There's no condition on which this is a good idea. And so those sorts of things have really big impact. And we have to think about what we replace with what, and are the alternatives better than the existing options? And if they aren't, maybe we shouldn't be doing it at all in the first place. So I don't know. Maybe straws are just bad. I don't know.
Have you noticed that torch the fields method that we always use on like everything? Have you noticed that? Like there's always this cutoff, like it needs to stop now type deal. And I go, even if we talk about plastic straws and people wanting to switch to paper straws, that's something like we got to switch from plastic to paper. And then someone just made the decision and then decided to start doing it. It's like, well, how about we spend some time, like get a group together and have a bunch of people think about what could be possible consequences of those types of things. It's kind of like where I started getting interested in risk management. Like, how do we manage our own risk? How do we know the risk options? How do you know how to make a proper decision on things? I mean, it's a very complicated scenario. It boils down to a lot of like emotions and things that are kind of unpredictable in a sense. But I mean, if you're working off a policy or some type of thing that gets implemented, whenever we base our policies, we base a policy off of like another country as well too, which I think is it's smart to look around the board, but I also think you can't do that when you're talking about geographical location as well too. I mean, everyone's complaint is like, well, how are you going to get China to fall in line with our energy sources? I'm like, well, you don't. You just lead by example. The issue is that when you get enough people on board, that thing that is really expensive starts to become very, very cheap. It starts to become basically useless. It's like the penny. The penny value is not really existent today because nobody can buy anything with a penny. But back in the day, it was. And that was now we have so many in circulation. Next, you know, it loses value. That's the same thing you do with energy sources. You got so much of this, so many solar panels, so many this, so many of this. Now more things are relying on it. It's going to cost more consumption, but you've gotten better with the technology. You know how to work it now. You've been working on it for so long. You're definitely going to find ways that it needs to be improved. I think the biggest thing about solar energy is it's energy storage. Because like if power cuts off just so people don't get electrocuted and that shuts off, and it's like where do we store the energy? How much do we are able to store compared to like a massive grid? Where I go, yeah, but you'll have some homes that'll implement it, some people that'll do that, and then some people that'll, you know, go a different route of things. But when we talk about like biofuel, like where do you expect that to like can that be factory use or is that just like cars and stuff?
Well, well, it can be anything, right? I mean, there's certainly an element of bioenergy that we want to put into the power grid, and the reason for that is, in principle, bioenergy is the only energy source that can be carbon negative. So it removes more CO2 from the atmosphere than it releases. A solar panel can only be neutral, as in it can only not emit any CO2. But of course, you have to make it. So in actual point of fact, a solar panel can only be carbon positive. So it can only emit small amounts of CO2, but it can't be carbon negative. And that that is an unfortunate consequence of the inefficiency of burning wood. So you get ash and that sort of thing, and so you get residual carbon that doesn't burn, and so you end up burying it, and that's a little tiny bit of carbon storage that adds up over time. The biggest use for biofuels, though, is of course in transport of various kinds, cars and trucks and potentially airplanes. But that's a little bit harder, and that's mostly because of the supply chain and scaling things up. And we can't instantly make as much bioethanol or biobutanol or biodiesel or whatever as we do gasoline. That can't convert overnight. The United States is up, I don't actually know what the numbers are, 12 or 13% bioethanol in the fuel mix. And that's been going since 2000, 2001, something like that. So 20 years. So it takes a while. It's very slow for us to turn over because the infrastructure has to build up, and it has to build up, and it has to build up, and it has to build up. And so we can't just flip a switch. And scientists, people, we're all the same, right? We want everything reduced to a football game. One side's good and one side's bad. We want those guys to win and we want those guys to lose. And unfortunately, in terms of energy, in terms of climate, in terms of everything, it's not like that. Nothing is completely good and nothing is completely bad. And there are pros and cons to everything. And you mentioned about geography. Yeah, those pros and cons are different in different geographies. And the best solution in Arizona is not the best solution in Oregon. And that should be quite obvious.
That's controversial. That's very
But
controversial.
it ends up not being quite so obvious because you get people with self-interest or whatever in line, and they reduce it to a football game. You see that with any political issue, and in fact, you see that with politics, right? If that side thinks it's good, then it must be bad because they're always wrong. And I think that it is human nature to want to follow that kind of an instinct. But scientists, we get in a lot of trouble. We're accused of being wishy-washy or contradictory or whatever. Well, not really. We just have a predilection for trying not to say something that's incorrect. And nothing is so universally good that it has no drawbacks. If it was, then there wouldn't be any. We'd already have it, right? If it was that good and that easy. And I think it's the same thing with biofuels, which is what I happen to work on, as it is with solar technologies. They have their plus points, they have their minus points, and that mix might be different in different places. And whenever talking about biomass, I mean, the story in a country like Brazil, which is renowned for their bioenergy and their bioethanol production, that sort of thing. Well, they also can grow anything. They're in the rainforest. This is like the best climate in the world. It's hot and it's wet. I mean, you can't think of a better place to do that. If you tried to implement that same system in New Mexico, you would find that it is very challenging to grow that much biomass in New Mexico that you can grow in Brazil for free. And so, of course, you'd want to be looking at different options there. And they've got geothermal energy, right? So whatever, right? They've got a lot of solar energy. So I think being sensible about how we deploy all of these technologies is a big part of that. But also people recognizing that it is always going to be better for the planet to live in certain areas and worse for the planet to live in other areas. Extreme climates have to be adapted for human use. And the research station at the South Pole, I'm sure has a gigantic carbon footprint. Maybe not. Maybe they get enough solar panels to counteract it, but I doubt it. Right? It's so cold down there. That is not a place that you would want to build a city. And I think we have to accept that is always going to be true. It is always going to be easier to adapt to certain areas than it is to others.
I got a couple questions. I think when we talk about like leading by example, if you notice, Arizona has a large like research funding about weather and climate, mostly because they live like in the desert in a sense. But they plant, like you, Max Lee was telling me, they plant bubble grass, they plant all these types of things, but there's unintended consequences when it comes to fires and there becomes these types of issues. But it does do like a really good thing about restoring kind of the land back to what it was before. But we don't want every single place to get to Arizona's point. We want to find out like ways that we can look at that as an example of like, yeah, we do need to be good stewards of the land that we're on. But I bring, when we talk about biofuels, are you talking about like cow, like it's not cow manure, is it? That's something completely different.
It must be completely different. There are lots of different types of biofuels. I mean, I personally work on trying to make what's called cellulosic ethanol, which is basically turning a tree into vodka. And then you use the vodka for a fuel. It's probably the easiest way of explaining it. We do this, of course, in the US with corn ethanol, but I'm looking at not using corn because it's a food source, but rather using trees in place of the corn. But it's the same principle. Other people work on what's called biodiesel, which is a replacement, be surprised, for diesel, which is made from oily plants or potentially algae, although that's, or algae, I guess it is in the US, but which is a much newer technology, far less developed. But it's replacing the fossil sources with the best renewable alternative we can. The advantage of those sorts of things, the advantage of using ethanol in place of gasoline, is it's not so hard to take a car that runs on gasoline and make it run on ethanol. So it's a much smaller shift in how things operate, and you can have the same range and you can have all this, and you don't need to, it'd be easy to change the fuel mix at a pump. Is much easier than installing charge points for an electric vehicle. And that's not to say we shouldn't have electric vehicles. I'm not at all saying that. It's just that this is a way of having multiple options for people who want to drive longer distances. Electric vehicles are fantastic in cities, but back to the people driving 2 hours, it's not so great if you're driving through the desert for 2 hours. That's not the type of vehicle that you want. And so having multiple options to fit multiple lifestyles is a way of keeping some of that convenience without giving all of it up and making everybody move into the city so that we can control all of our problems. And we often think about electricity as if it's perfectly clean. Well, it is when you use it, but it's not when you make it. And I always tell somebody, whenever you turn on the lights, you're burning natural gas. So you're burning methane when you turn on the lights, unless you're in China, and then you're burning coal. But whatever, you're burning stuff. When you do that, you're just burning it out in the countryside. And so it's a bit of pollution exportation.
That's what I heard about electric cars, was that the wiring for them or the lines that make that actually cost more carbon than what it is. It's like a long, I don't, is that controversial too?
It is. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, it isn't a lot different, I guess, is the safest way of putting it. So without getting, as a scientist, without getting myself into trouble, the safest way of putting it is it isn't a lot different. The efficiency of a gas turbine in a power station is higher than the efficiency of the internal combustion engine in a car. So in terms of converting fuel to power, a power station is better at that than a car is. Of course, you get losses in transmission, as you say, in the lines. The batteries in an electric vehicle are heavier, so the car is heavier, and so it requires more energy to move it. And in the end, all of the studies I have seen suggest that the electric vehicles are a bit better, but it's not night and day. If we switched our electricity supply over to something renewable, then it's night and day, right? So burning gasoline versus a solar panel, oh yeah, that's a huge difference. But burning gasoline in a car versus burning methane in a power station, it's actually not that big of a move up. And so I think, again, back to the football analogy. I mean, I don't want to say one of them is definitely better than the other, because it will change over time. If we decarbonize our electrical grid, then electric cars become a much better option even than biofuels. Until we decarbonize our electrical grid, you'll want to use biofuels. Once we decarbonize the electrical grid, of course, now you start to have options. What do we use that decarbonized electricity for? And the more things we use electricity for, the more of that electricity we're going to need. And so all of those things sort of snowball. And so I always feel like having more options is better, because it enables you to get away from the stuff we know is bad and towards things that we know are better, even if they're not perfect.
So I'm going to ask you a deeper question, I would say. And it would be on an aspect. Do you think that this is just a transitional period, like this generation and then this kind of gap, maybe 100 years or so? I know we've been like, we are now learning more about the consequences of our actions that we've been doing for a very long time. But those consequences were always there. These things were always there. And I start going, what we're dealing with now is a very sensitive situation, because a media report on one thing, or this type of thing on this thing, or this first impression on this thing can completely shape the way that society is going to go. I mean, if something comes out that electric cars are actually way more worse than any other thing out there, then nobody's going to buy electric cars, and then you're completely cutting off that arm. There's no access to electric things, anything, and even skepticizing on the idea of like anything that else would be electric energy. People probably wouldn't trust it after cars were this type of situation like that. It happened with Tesla. I mean, Tesla, they all they did was report on the car accidents that happened to it, and that scared people from driving Teslas. Now you're starting to see it kind of flip back around, where people are starting to get Teslas and stuff like that. Whether you like Elon or not, it's just this aspect of like, this is a transitional period. I think we're going to figure it out. I just hopefully we don't. What option are we going to choose that might actually be the better option? Because you don't want to look back 100 years later and be like, "Damn, we should have did this way instead of doing that." But then there was this scandal that came out. I mean, you mentioned before about like the controversy with like biomass. What exactly is the controversy behind that?
Well, 100 years thing is an interesting point, by the way, because of course we've only, the industrial age is only 100 years old. We've only had electricity for like 150 years. In
Ben
homes,
Frank.
yeah. Well, okay, but his house didn't have power in it. We've only had telephones for 140 years, right? I mean, it's amazing how long 100 years really is. You're talking about the 1920s, 100 years ago. And, I'm old enough now, growing up in the 1980s. Well, the 1980s are to now what the 1940s were when I was a kid. And oh my God, that seemed like a different era. And so, yes, it is all a transition. 100 years is a long time. When you think about what life was like in the 1920s, we didn't have plastic. So there wasn't a plastic pollution problem because there wasn't any plastic yet. That's roughly when it was invented and when we started using it. And so, yeah, I expect 100 years from now, the world's going to look a lot different. I wish I could predict what it would look like, but having just barely being old enough to remember when there was no internet, you could not even imagine that, what changes that would bring, right? And so predicting what life is going to be like 30 years from now is a fool's errand, because something immensely disruptive is going to come along and change everything. But yes, we don't want to be stupid in the meantime. And you mentioned about biomass. What's the controversy? Is take away crops that people eat and replace them with crops that people use for energy. So that's dumb. So starving people in order to drive around is a really stupid trade-off. And I don't think there's any two ways about that. And so we have to be sensible about this. This is why I work on making biofuels from trees. We don't eat trees. And so as long as we plant more trees than we cut down, or I guess you could say plant enough trees to absorb more CO2 than the trees that we do cut down, then we are not contributing in a net positive way to the environment. And so getting the technologies to be efficient enough that that's a reality is what scientists like me work on. We're not quite there yet, but we are very close. And I'd like to think that that transition is going to be a relatively easy one. And sure, eventually, my ideas will seem just as stupid and outdated as the idea of using a candle to light the room. And yeah, I won't live to see it, but I would hope that we keep evolving as a species, that things keep getting better and better. Of course, I would hope so.
What do you think has more impact, strategically placing where we're going to plant trees, or do you think it would be easier to be able to maybe modify the trees in a sense to store more carbon?
Oh, well, okay, it would be better if we could modify the trees. That actually would go over much better in the United States than it would in Europe, where they don't like genetically modifying plants. It makes them very upset.
But they
Uh,
like modifying their kids.
they're really weird people, I have to say. But then again, so are we. So I don't mind. I do often joke with my friends that Europeans seem to think that genetically modified food will cause birth defects and things. I said, well, we've been eating genetically modified corn in the U.S. for 100 years. I haven't noticed the third ears and the fifth eyes and things popping up yet. Our life expectancy, until we got really fat, our life expectancy was doing pretty good. And so I don't think that's going to be an issue. But sure, I mean, when you start talking about trees, now you're going to really big scale, right? And so, do genetically modifying trees to store more carbon, that is a great idea, provided we're not creating any unintended consequences. So we need to be really, really sure that we're not stepping into something that's even worse. I don't tend to think so. So I think that's probably a good idea, but it is something I understand fairly well, but not perfectly. Deciding where to plant things, that would be great, but it's back to the convenience and inconvenience of moving people around. So what would you want to do? Well, you would want to turn Brazil into a gigantic um, uh, forest of plants, right? Move all the people out and just turn that into a huge farm. I mean, that's what you would want to do. Well, okay, that's not very nice to the poor Brazilians, right? So let's not do that. So we do have to be sensible about not deciding that what's best for people living in London or New York or Washington or wherever is great. And let's just inconvenience all the people in the countryside. I mean, nobody lives in Iowa. We could just grow plants there. We don't need any cities. Well, no, that's not fair either. So we have to be sure that if we're going to decide where to plant certain things, that we're not negatively impacting biodiversity and that we're not massively inconveniencing part of the population to serve the whole, because that's kind of mean.
Yeah, but don't oil companies do that when they go and mine somewhere? Like my grandpa always used to tell me when I was digging in the backyard or something. He goes, "If you find oil, call me because we're going to be rich." And I just figured he was talking about like, oh, an oil company would come by and find this and then probably profit off of it by getting us to move somewhere. So I mean, companies do it. They make people move by just incentivizing them with money. I'm not saying we have to move a whole country. I wasn't going to that degree, but I was like, because I've been dabbling with AI and learning a lot about it, and I start going, what happens if it like we made an AI system that was able to make like the issues without the political kind of sides being brought in, would just make a strictly logical decision based on the evidence of whatever it's reading or something like that. And you get to this aspect of like, imagine if it found like a plot point or it found a certain point on the earth that would be the most beneficial, that would have like some type of weird location aspect to it that would be able to suck up more carbon than anywhere else. This is maybe if it's even by a percent. And I start going, it doesn't need to be such a large scale where it's a whole country or something, but if you had like just a giant portion, maybe like a few hundred acres or something like that. And whenever I hear someone talk about like planting trees or something like that, whenever I hear the argument is always like, what happens if they get burned down? And I think that's because there was a large thing with wildfires that were happening. But there is a survey from 2001 to 2019 from California saying that a lot of those fires were man created. So you got to keep that in mind as well too. I mean, as much as that argument can be used for people on the other side that think that the planet's not warming, you could use the same argument for the same aspect of taking down a renewable, where you start going, there's problems with everything. But getting it more sustainable, taking care of the land, if you're going to plant a bunch of stuff, do you think that we would just leave it there and expect it to do its work while we went away? No, we'd probably maintenance it. We'd take care of it. We'd make sure that there were things in place to make sure that those wildfires didn't occur.
Yeah, we do have to manage it, and we do have to be sensible about it. And the wildfire thing, I mean, I've heard that before, and it drives me nuts. There's a coal fire in, I think it started in West Virginia, now it's in Pennsylvania, but it could be the other way around. But there's a coal fire on a coal seam underground that has been burning in the sort of Pennsylvania, West Virginia region for, I think, 120 years that we started in a mine. And it keeps going, right? So it's not like fossil fuels aren't prone to environmental disasters either. And so I don't think it's particularly controversial, non-controversial. It's just both of them have got issues that will have to be managed. And so, yeah, you don't want to set fire to in Iraq or Kuwait, I should say, on the way out. The Iraqi army, or Saddam Hussein, he's dead, so we can blame him, set fire to the oil wells to make sure that the Americans couldn't have the oil. So again, poured a bunch of oil in the desert. Actually, it's still there, incidentally, in the desert in Kuwait. A whole bunch of oil that was in their reservoirs was poured, was dumped into the desert,
That's
to
like a
make sure
big
that
middle finger. That's a big middle finger to people.
exactly. But what is it? It's a massive environmental disaster caused by fossil fuel usage, right? The Exxon Valdez, when I was a kid, right, and hitting whatever in Alaska and spilling oil everywhere. So the more recently the Gulf of Mexico and the oil spill that was going on there for months. So that everything has got potential disasters associated with it. Any activity human beings undertake at massive scale can cause massive problems. And managing that risk is extremely important. And so preventing wildfires would be an important part of expanding forests. Absolutely. And whatever we do, we have got to make sure it doesn't happen. And lithium ion batteries, I actually saw recently a car with a lithium ion battery that caught fire. Oh my God, the thing burned for hours. Yes, that can be very dangerous. Make sure it doesn't happen. This is how you deal with that. Or don't use it. But if you don't use it, well, petrol cars can explode. So it's not like any of this is a free ride, right? Maybe not explode quite the way they do in the movies, but there are dangers there too. And so I think I think we have to accept that just because something has a drawback, it's not perfect, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because what we're doing now also has drawbacks. We're just used to them. And as we change things, we are going to make mistakes, and there are going to be problems. And if we do plant more forests, we're going to have wildfires, and people are going to immediately say, oh, this wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done it. It's like, well, what didn't happen? Right? How many natural disasters, hurricanes or whatever didn't happen because we changed the way that we were behaving? And you don't hear about those things. You hear about pollution, but you don't hear about avoided pollution. And you hear about disasters, but you don't hear about avoided disasters. If we never flew again, there would be no more plane crashes, and you wouldn't hear about them. You wouldn't hear about not plane crashes. So I don't, I'm not necessarily advocating against air travel, but what I am saying is that the non-events don't make the news, and so they don't cause controversy. But we have to recognize that there are drawbacks to anything that we do, and there are always problems that we can cause. And the capacity for human beings to cause problems is endless. I would hope that our capacity to solve problems is equally endless.
One thing I learned off social media, because I only just post and I go away, was like my focus in life has changed. I know that sounds crazy, but like just my focus when it comes to, I'm not worried about all the bad shit anymore. Like it's like it's still there. It's like there's still a conscious of like you worry about some things, but I don't come across like I know so many of my friends that go like, oh, Trump and all this and COVID and this. And it's like, dude, I've been off social media. I have no idea what the hell's going on. Like it's because that's clickbait. That's clickbait for them. Is it? And I think that skews our focus in the long run. After a while of just worrying about all the problems, all you can think about in life is pessimism. You can only look at the bad parts or look at this. It's like, yeah, but what about the things that it didn't do? The things that we're not talking about because that doesn't sell. And I think, in next 5, 10 years, I think with the amount of people that are kind of really hating the aspect of social media on so many things, I think it's good. I think it's a good thing. But I also think you can make your social media experience positive. It's great to be on social media. But I think each person needs to have that. I think you need a break. It doesn't need to be permanent. I just think maybe a week or so, like just stop refreshing your follower count and kind of step back from it for a minute, and you start realizing how like you cared about something so much that is really so sensitive and doesn't really play a giant factor in really anything. And I think you have a different experience then. Then now I'm experiencing things on social media where I go, well, this is interesting. Let me learn more about this, or let me learn more about this, rather than tweeting an article I see the headline for. I mean, I'm not saying social media is a giant problem at all. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when it comes to when you're so involved in something and you don't take that step back to look at it from an outside view. That's why they always say outside eyes looking in, give you like a, if you have a problem in your life, a friend could help you out and give you some really good advice. That's something you can do with every single aspect, whatever you're focused on or whatever you're continually worried about. But people don't do that. I mean, that's why there's a lot of people that advocate for sleep, because that sleep, when you wake up, you're like, oh my God, why was I so upset about that before? You need that break. You need that little bit of tension. And that's with everything. I think a lot of people that would call themselves climate alarmists, or people that are like screaming and throwing paint on people or something like that, I'm like, just take a step back for a minute and like just look at everything. And then you kind of like when you balance it out in your head, you can kind of talk about it. Like the whole thing about people is that they don't like being shouted at. They really don't. As much as Jersey Shore's fun to watch, it's not them being shouted at. And you got to we got to talk about these types of things because that's how we're going to grow. I mean, right now, people are talking about asteroid mining. I've talked to people about that. I've talked to people about space colonization. And I'm like, how do you expect to fucking not mess up that planet? Like what we gotta work on. We don't have the right to leave right now. We don't have the right to move off this earth until we're able to fix our crap. And we can't just push our problems onto another planet. Like that has to be a discussion that's brought to the table. But if you're in space colonization and you're working to get that going, if you're an astrobiologist, which is a fascinating trade in its own, you aren't really worried so much about that. You're more worried about an aspect of what your field is involved in. Where I go, this is the best time to try and conversate with people that you would probably never talk to in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a, I mean, it's a somewhat controversial book. I think it's about 5 years old now. It's called, I think the title was Factfulness, but I can't remember. It was by a Swedish scientist who's died shortly after publication. But basically, avoiding the
Wait,
controversial.
hold on. Is it controversial death or is it
Oh no, the book
okay?
is controversial. I think he died of natural causes. He was quite old,
Part of the Clinton
uh,
body count. I got you.
but forgetting the controversial parts of the book, the basic premise was that what people need to do more of is examine the facts rather than listen to the arguments. And back to what we were saying earlier about the sort of the confirmation bias. The news only reports things that are sensational. Well, why would they report things that were boring, right? 7.5 billion people yesterday didn't die. I mean, that's actually not that interesting, right? So the only things that get reported are disasters or events or arguments or fights or whatever. And that sort of leads us to think that those things are happening much more frequently than they are. And then people do a lot of surveys and they examine people's opinions on how often certain things happen, like lightning strikes and sort of thing. And you find out that people vastly overestimate how many people die from meteor strikes or something, because you see one on the news and you're like, oh my God, this must happen, 15 times a day or something. No, actually, it almost never happens, right? And
Spontaneous combustion. I was worried about that when I was a kid.
exactly, right. And so the rare events are the things that get reported, and so you suddenly start thinking that those events are a lot less rare than they really are. And I think that's universally true. And social media only accelerates these things. They were always happening. They're just happening faster now. And part of what we were talking about earlier with people picking sides, you mentioned Trump. I mean, it's a great example. People who love Trump, whatever he says must be right, and people who hate him, whatever he says must be wrong. I'll have to say, having witnessed him from afar, sometimes he has a point. Um, Most of the time, I don't think so. It's a personal opinion, but I would not say he's 100% right or 100% wrong, and I would not say that Joe Biden's 100% right or 100% wrong. Right? I mean, everybody. I'm not 100% right, 100% wrong. I don't even agree with myself 100% of the time. Right? I say all kinds of things, and then later on, I'm like, yeah, no, that probably wasn't right.
I get classified as a libertarian, but I just tell people I don't think I'm that either, because I go Illuminati. There's someone else pulling the strings. I don't think it's black cloaks and stuff, but I think big business has a very weird relationship with our political system, and I don't trust anything anybody says.
But it might be safest. I don't know. I moved countries, and I moved to a country that's significantly leftwards along the political spectrum to the U.S. And yeah, so you get reclassified quite quickly.
As
So
long as I can,
I don't even know where I stand in US on the US spectrum anymore,
as
but
long
I
as I
know.
can drink a beer on my back porch and complain about my depression, I don't care what happens. Like,
But regardless of the politics, I mean, I think my central point is that yeah, I mean, you only hear about people agreeing strongly or disagreeing strongly with things, and again, I mean, nobody talks about things that don't have two sides, so it's not an issue if there aren't two sides to it, and so anything that comes up, God forbid, anything that goes to a vote in government, so in Congress, anything that's brought up during a presidential campaign, those things are issues. And the environment is an issue, and climate change is an issue. And that means that it has more than one side. If it didn't have more than one side, it wouldn't be an issue, and nobody would ever talk about it. I've rarely, if ever, heard anyone suggest that it should be legal to go around poisoning people. Therefore, it does not come up a lot in campaigns whether or not it should be legal to poison people. It's pretty non-controversial, so it's not an issue, and so it doesn't get talked about. And uh, I'm not so stupid as to think that just because I have very strong opinions on things like climate change means that other people don't have strong opinions on the other side. I mean, I have a lot of academic credentials in the subject, and I have a lot of facts at my disposal. I haven't seen any facts that disagree with my position, so I tend to think I'm probably right. I always laugh about the climate deniers because the top, well, whatever it is, 3%. I think now actually they've refigured, and it's 99.3% of climate scientists believe in climate change. It used to be 97, but they sort of resurveyed. But regardless, as an academic, I can tell you that I'm aware of very few fields that even have 50% agreement. I mean, 99%, this is nuts, right? I mean, this is well past the unanimous point for a scientific argument. We are never that sure of ourselves. And so yeah, I mean, you can always find somebody that will disagree, but man, oh man.
I'm not a climate denier, but can I say I'm climate curious?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm always I'm curious about everything. But yeah, I mean, I certainly believe in climate change. I can't possibly be a coincidence, although the increase in temperature, even during my lifetime, the increase in temperature is staggering. It's noticeable.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I just from people I have on, people assume I'm a climate denier. I'm like, no, I'm generally just trying to talk to everybody's perspective in it because it's the only way I can make my own opinion on anything. I mean, doesn't mean you have to believe all the crazy people. Obviously, like I'm not going to believe a young Earth. I mean, my best friend's a flat earther, so it's like, what do I do with that? I don't know. You actually, when you mentioned the Earth was 4 billion years old, my head just went. I know I have someone that commented on my video who's a young Earth creationist, and I'm like,
Oh,
that's going to be controversial. But look, I mean, if
sorry,
it's
sorry about that. I
no,
forget about that one sometimes.
I
Yeah.
don't even know what it is entirely. It's crazy, but I get to this point where I go, as long as we can still have a discussion, like the one thing that I always boil down to with topics, and the one reason why I try and like talk about the climate topic when I was emailing was just I wanted to talk about this type of thing without it being a heated debate or some type of thing. I just want to generally ask questions and generally not be yelled at for the questions that I ask, because you have to come at these types of things where if you start looking at someone like you're higher up than them, even if it's degrees and all these stuffs aside, you no longer consider me your equal. And that's where people feel invalidated. And that's where we get people that run off and they just want to scream and yell and say, no, I believe that this and I believe that this. They think that way because they're not feeling like they're having a voice in some sense as well too. And I just go like, we can calmly have a discussion about this, because the one thing that is real is the fact that we're not doing anything about anything that we're talking about doing. Like, so we got to get over that thing. There's a lot of talk in the air, and I get people are working on things. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying, but when we get into debates about stuff like that, it's like we got to move past it. We got to drop the subject. We got to do something. Pick it up later when it's not so politically tied. I don't know, but we can do a lot of great things. The Venus Project. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, about getting the whole. Yeah, that sounds crazy to us now, but I mean, if we actually get to a point where something does happen and we do get to this scenario where that does seem plausible, I mean, that's the idea that they're going into space with. They're saying the Venus Project idea. We can't just claim things for ourselves anymore. We have to look at a global standpoint here. And I think, I mean, those are laudable goals that we can reach, but We just got to talk about it. We can't just tweet. Can't just tweet.
No, and again, I think you mentioned this earlier, but it might have been before we started. But I tend to think of things in slightly less controversial ways, right? Forget climate change. Even if you're a climate change denier, I've never heard even a climate change denier suggest that it is a good idea to pump 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. How can that be good? That can't be good. You may say that, or you may believe that it isn't nearly as bad as scientists like me believe, and we're not infallible, so possibly we're wrong. But I think you'd have to stretch things quite far to suggest this is a good idea, and so we shouldn't do it, right? Because it definitely causes problems, regardless of what impact you want to attribute to climate change. Okay, the temperature is going up. If you want to say that's being caused by something else, even though we're going into an ice age, but whatever. If you want to suggest that we are, well, it's like 10,000 years off, but yes, we are. I think we're overdue. But yes, the Earth's supposed to be cooling right now. Geologically, it's supposed to be cooling. But anyway, even if you want to say that this is being caused by sunspots or something, I don't know, very prolonged 100-year sunspots, then there are other problems that are caused by pumping CO2 in the atmosphere and burning fossil fuels. These cause other issues. Drilling for oil causes issues, right? There are other environments. I mentioned the oil spill in the Gulf a few years ago. It's bad, right? That's bad. I've never heard anyone say that was good. It's not good. And so
wait, was that the one that was trending with like people putting Bible references up saying like it's the end of days because there's a giant oil refinery in the middle of the ocean where there's like a giant hole that looked like, you know what I'm talking about?
No, I didn't see that, but possibly. But
people are like, it's the end of days. The sea was on fire. It was nuts. It looked like Superman had just went from outer space into the hole in the ocean. It was an oil refinery issue.
Oh, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, we should not do things that are stupid. And drilling holes in the earth to get stuff out of it just isn't a good idea. So anything we can do to stop doing that sort of thing is good. And forget which environmental consequences you want to attribute to it. Pollution is fairly non-controversial, even if climate change is. And I think that much air pollution is just bad. Changing the composition of the atmosphere is not good. And obviously, I mean, unless you really, really don't believe in science, like you don't believe in measurements, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has increased 25% in my lifetime. I'm 45. It's increased 25% or 20% in my lifetime. That's a lot, and that can't be good. So, we attribute it in the greenhouse effect and all of this, but okay, leave that aside. Even there are other reasons why that's not good. And so I think part of the evolution of humanity should be to do better. And I think we can do better, regardless of what motives you want to attribute to that better. I think we can do better.
I'm with you on that. Jason, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. You've given me plenty of your time. I love the shirt, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
I could have worn mine. We could have coordinated, but it's okay. Where can people find all your links? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have any other websites you want to promote as well too?
I do. Well, I do have a Twitter. It's at Hallett Group. Hallett with 2 L's and 2 T's, if you like. But it's where I just send out tweets about how awesome my academic publications are. So you can like them or not. You can find me on the Imperial College website, which is www.imperial.ac.uk. And you'd have to search for my name, but that's fine if you really want to find me. Then you can come to my office and protest outside. I would not be happy about that. But otherwise, I'm happy to talk to anyone about anything.
I am following you on Twitter.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
But thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.